Good day, everyone. I'd like to welcome you back to Contemplating Catholicism. I'd like to address the question today: where is God in the face of suffering and death? On one level, I think that it's really not an appropriate question because the question asks, well, God, suffering and death shouldn't be part of my experience, but it is, and we're questioning really God's sovereignty. But there are times when we're tempted to ask that question: where is God in the face of this suffering and death? Particularly when we're going in the midst of it, it comes to mind. It's part of our struggle of faith. I remember one time in our experience, my wife and I experienced 3 deaths and a lot of suffering during this particular time. We experienced a miscarriage. She miscarried one of our children. And of course, when you are expecting, you are looking forward to a new child, all that comes with that. But then suddenly there's a miscarriage and all goes wrong with that, and your hopes and your dreams are dashed. What you envisioned in your mind is not a reality. And you're tempted to ask, well, where is God in this death? I remember within a year after experiencing this miscarriage, within a year, my oldest sister died. She was in her 30s. She was going to get up and go to work the next day. We spent the night at my parents' house. And in the middle of the night, my mom comes up to the room where we were sleeping and she shakes me and she said, "Chris, Ann died. Ann died." And I thought, well, this is some kind of a bad dream I'm having. But she continued to shake me and I woke up and realized, no, this is reality. Went over to her house about 8 miles away, and uh, my brother-in-law was there, and he was grief-stricken because his wife died unexpectedly in the middle of the night. She was going to get up and go to work. Life completely changed. 3 children that came down the steps one by one. My brother-in-law had to tell them one by one, your mom died. And experiencing that grief and of the children, of her mate, and of my parents. This was their firstborn that died. I thought, well, where is God in the face of this? Wasn't long after that, my dad, who had been suffering from leukemia from the time he was 50, he was at the latter stages of leukemia. Looked like he had just got out of the Dachau prison camp. He was all gaunt and sucked in and very little energy, had his leg cut off below the knee. Not long after that, he too died. And you wonder, well, where is God in the face of this suffering and death? I had to make some changes in my theology. I was finishing my theological studies at this time in seminary. I knew some things in my mind, but it wasn't necessarily part of my heart and experience. And I asked that question: where is God in this? In one sense, it was really the wrong question to dwell on for very long. Because was God somehow accountable to me for this suffering and death? Were we somehow exempt from suffering and death as a family? Does he somehow owe us a full life? Is God accountable in any way to us for what happens or what he allows in our lives? And the answer, of course, is no. He's God. I'm not God. My family's not God. He doesn't owe us anything. He doesn't owe us an explanation why things happen. It was Pope Benedict who said this back in 2015. He said, "Man no longer believes he needs justification before God, but rather he's of the opinion that God is obliged to justify himself of all the horrible things in the world, and in the face of the misery of being human, all of which ultimately depend upon him." We're saying, well, we at times think, well, it's all God's fault. God is accountable to me, not me to him. He needs to justify himself to the world. Why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? But there again, he is God. We are not. I'm not. God is not accountable to any one of us for anything. That was the great lesson that Job had to learn the hard way. He wanted to justify himself before God. His friends wanted to say it's your fault, and his wife wanted him to curse God and die. Going through all of this, what does God finally do after all of these speeches from his, quote, three friends, where they try to blame him? He did something to deserve this. What does God do at the end? Something very strange. He takes Job on a nature lesson. And then he asks Job the question as he explains different aspects of creation. Job, were you there? Do you understand creation? Job, you can't even understand creation. How are you going to understand the suffering that you're going through? Fact is, he didn't understand it. Only God really understood the great plan he had for Job. We don't understand it. But there again is that element of trust that in the face of suffering and death, there's this aspect there we have to step back from it and say, Lord, I don't understand it. I may never understand it, but you are God and I'm not. We have a generation today that has a difficult time accepting adversity. I think previous generations accepted it more readily because they experienced it more. It was tough. People died, people suffered, people had to go through tough times. Today, maybe not so much. Maybe that's part of our problem, is that we've been coddled. We've been coddled in many different ways. And then when something adverse actually happens, we have a difficult time accepting it. We somehow think that God is to blame for it, because in actuality, what God actually owes me is a pain-free life. God owes me just smooth sailing. But life isn't like that, is it? We better come up with a theology of suffering. And where does that really begin? I believe that Catholics have a better theology of suffering than any other group. And one of the reasons for that is we're obsessed with the cross. A cross like the one here that has a corpus on it, the body of Christ. Now, why do we have those? I have one here, and there's some over here, some crosses with corpus on it. And I have another one up here, and I have another one over there. Why are Catholics so obsessed with this thing, the cross, with a corpus on it? It's part of our theology of suffering. We recognize that God Himself is not exempt from suffering. To ask the question, where is God in suffering, is really, when it gets down to it, is really a stupid question. Because God Himself suffered more than we can imagine. God Himself, the incarnate Lord Jesus Christ, who became man, went to the cross. He suffered in unimaginable ways that we'll never fathom. And yet we ask ourselves, well, where is God in my suffering? I have a headache today. We contemplate suffering. When we go through the rosary, one of the decades or one of the mysteries that we contemplate are the sorrowful mysteries, where Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane sweat like drops of blood. And we meditate upon that. We recognize this agony in the garden that He went through. We also contemplate this scourging on His back by the Roman soldiers, where His flesh was ripped open. Many people wouldn't survive it. It was so horrendous. We contemplate Him being stripped of His clothing, Him being spit upon and buffeted, punched, a crown of thorns put upon His head, and mocked as the soldiers knelt before Him and said, "Hail, King of the Jews." We contemplate Jesus carrying His cross up to the place called Golgotha, the place of the skull, carrying that cross because He chose it. He chose to suffer. This is God Himself who became man. To ask the question, where is God in suffering, is really a stupid question. When you think about God being nailed to the cross, real nails, real flesh, suffering for 6 hours on the day we celebrate as Good Friday, being mocked while He was there, said, "Come down from the cross if you're the Son of God." Being mocked, being ridiculed, and suffering unimaginably. And we ask, well, where is God in my suffering? Is really a stupid question. But we're tempted to say it sometimes, aren't we? On another level, when we ask, where is God in our suffering? We have to ask ourselves, well, why did God do this to begin with? Why did God identify with our suffering? Was it because for Himself that He was going to get something out of it? It was for us. It was so that we might experience life, that we might experience something far better than what we experience as a result of the sin of Adam. Adam and Eve lived in this perfect setting of the garden, were kicked out of it, and because of sin, there was pain and death and shame and blame. And one of their sons was a murderer. And we live in a world that's full of all that kind of stuff now. The pain, the suffering, the sweat, the tears. But Jesus came to give us something much better. He rose again from the dead. By faith, we are brought into union with his death and his resurrection. And as children of God, we have hope. Hope for something even better than the Garden of Eden because we're with him. And we're in a place in him where God calls us his friend, where we are his beloved. We're the bride of Christ. Something far better. And we read in the book of Revelation that there's this city, there's this garden, there's this place that's far better than what was experienced even back early on in Genesis. To ask the question, where is God in all of this? We have to understand the whole picture. If we just focus on the here and now, this little period of time where we experience some pain and death, and we don't look at the full picture, we ask the wrong question. God has something much greater in mind. And finally, we ask, where is God in all this suffering and death? Maybe another question we need to ask is, why do I cause so much suffering in this world? Why do I cause other people to suffer? I think back of some of my indiscretion early in my youth and realize I hurt a lot of people. Certainly by taking advantage of people sexually. Why? I inflicted that pain. I inflicted some pain on my children because I was so busy working for the Lord. I, at times, was just too busy for them. And I caused pain and suffering. Maybe the question doesn't need to be so much, why does God allow this pain and suffering? Maybe it should be, why do I cause pain and suffering? And maybe we need to go to a different level with that and say, Lord, how can I help other people who are suffering that I see each day? My wife and I recently experienced something with someone from our church who is seeming to be losing her mind. And it's a difficult thing for people to witness. But we see it all the time. There's people suffering around us that we try to pray for and minister to, but we can't do it on our own strength. We can't do it all. But perhaps we're starting to ask the right question when we say, not so much, Lord, why did you allow this suffering? Maybe the question needs to be, Lord, how can I help this person in their suffering? Maybe that's the more appropriate question. Lord, help us to do that. You might be going through a tremendous time of suffering. The only thing we can really do is try to back off from it and say, Lord, what is your purpose in this? We may not totally understand it. We may not ever totally understand it, but God does have a purpose. We know that He loves us with an everlasting love. And we need to embrace that love through that suffering. And then, Lord, how can I help others who suffer? How can I weep with those who weep? And how can I pray for those who are undergoing a tremendous suffering? Lord, help me to experience a little bit of the suffering that you experience. That's a dangerous prayer, but it's necessary. Thank you very much. We need to trust the Lord as we undergo some things that perhaps we don't always understand. Thank you very much. You have a great day.